Speak Memory by Vladimir Nabokov. An autobiography revised. To Vera. Speak Memory. Board. The present work is a systematically correlated assemblage of personal recollections ranging geographically from St. Petersburg to St. Nazaire and covering 37 years from August 1903 to May 1940, with only a few sallies into later spacetime. The essay that initiated the series corresponds to what is now Chapter 5. I wrote it in French under the title of Mademoiselle O 30 years ago in Paris, where Jean Paulhan published it in the second issue of Measure 1936. A photograph published recently in Giselle Frun's James Joyce in Paris commemorates this event, except that I am wrongly identified in the Measures group relaxing around a garden table of stone as Audeberti. In America, where I migrated on May 28, 1940, Mademoiselle O was translated by the late Hilda Ward into English, revised by me, and published by Edward Weeks in the January 1943 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, which was also the first magazine to print my stories written in America. My association with the New Yorker had begun through Edmund Wilson, with a short poem in April 1942, followed by other fugitive pieces, but my first prose composition appeared there only on January 3rd, 1948. This was Portrait of My Uncle, Chapter 3 of the complete work, written in June 1947 at Columbine Lodge, Estes Park, Colo, where my wife, child, and I could have stayed much longer had not Harold Ross hit it off so well the ghost of my past. The same magazine also published Chapter 4, My English Education, March 27, 1948, Chapter 6, Butterflies, June 12, 1948, Chapter 7, Colette, July 31, 1948, and Chapter 9, My Russian Education, September 18, 1948, all written in Cambridge, Mass., at a time of great mental and physical stress, as well as Chapter 10, Curtain Raiser, January 1, 1949, Chapter 2, Portrait of My Mother, April 9, 1949, Chapter 12, Tamara, December 10, 1949. Chapter 8, Lantern Slides, February 11, 1950. H.R.'s query, Were the Nabokovs a one-nutcracker family? Chapter 1, Perfect Past, April 15, 1950. And Chapter 15, Gardens and Parks, June 17, 1950. And all written in Ithaca, New York. Of the remaining 3 chapters, Chapters 11 and 14 appeared in a Parisian Review, First Poem, September 1949, and Exile, January-February 1951, while Chapter 13 went to Harper's Magazine, Lodgings in Trinity Lane, January 1951. The English version of Mademoiselle O has been republished in 9 stories, New Directions, 1947, and Nabokov's Dozen, Doubleday, 1958, Heinemann, 1959, Popular Library, 1959, and Penguin Books, 1960. In the letter collection, I also included First Love, which became the darling of anthologists. Although I had been composing these chapters in the erratic sequence reflected by the dates of first publication given above, they had been neatly filling numbered gaps in my mind, which follow the present order of chapters. That order had been established in 1936, the placing of Cornerstone, which already held in its hidden hollow various maps, timetables, a collection of matchboxes, a chip of ruby glass, and even, as I now realize, the view from my balcony of Geneva Lake, of its ripples and glades of light, black dotted today at tea time with coots and tufted ducks. I had no trouble, therefore, in assembling a volume which Harper and Brothers of New York brought out in 1951 under the title Conclusive Evidence of my having existed. Unfortunately, the phrase suggested a mystery story, and I planned to entitle the British edition Speak Mnemosyne, but was told that little old ladies would not want to ask for a book whose title they could not pronounce. I also toyed with the Anthemion, which is the name of a honeysuckle ornament, consisting of elaborate interlacements and expanding clusters, but nobody liked it, so we finally settled for Speak Memory, Galank's 1951, and the Universal Library, New York, 1960. Its translations are Russian by the author Drugi Berega, the Chicago Publishing House, New York, 1954, French by Ivan David, Autres Rivages, Gallimard, 1961, Italian by Bruno Adera, Parla, Ricordo, Mondadori, 1962, Spanish by Jaime Pinheiro Gonzalez, Habla Memoria, 1963, and German by Dieter A. Zimmer, Roholt, 1964. This exhausts the necessary amount of bibliographic information which literary critics were annoyed by the note at the end of Nabokov dozen, will be, I hope, hypnotized into accepting at the beginning of the present work. While writing the first version in America, I was handicapped by an almost complete lack of data in regard to family history, and consequently by the impossibility of checking my memory when I felt it might be at fault. My father's biography has been amplified now and revised. Numerous other revisions and additions have been made, especially in the earlier chapters. Certain type parentheses have been opened and allowed to spill their still active contents. Or else an object which had been a mere dummy chosen at random and of no factual significance in the account of an important event kept bothering me every time I reread in passage the course of correcting the proofs of various editions, until finally I made a great effort in the arbitrary spectacles which Mnemosyne must have needed more than anybody else were metamorphosed into a clearly recalled oyster-shell-shaped cigarette case, gleaming in the wet grass at the foot of an aspen on the Chemin du Pendu, where I found on that June day in 1907 a hawk moth rarely met with so far west, and where a quarter of a century earlier my father had netted a peacock butterfly very scarce in our northern woodlands. In the summer of 1953, at a ranch near Portal, Arizona, a rented house in Ashland, Oregon, and at various motels in the West and Midwest, I managed between butterfly hunting and writing Lolita and Panine to translate Speak Memory with the help of my wife into Russian. Because of the psychological difficulty of replaying a theme elaborated in my Dar, the Gift, I omitted one entire chapter, 11. On the other hand, I've revised many passages and tried to do something about the amnesic defects of the original. Blank spots, blurry areas, domains of dimness. I discovered that sometimes by means of intense concentration the neutral smudge might be forced to come into beautiful focus so that the sudden view could be identified, and the anonymous servant named. For the present final edition of Speak Memory, I have not only introduced basic changes and copious additions to the initial English text, but have availed myself of the corrections I made while turning it into Russian. This re-Englishing of a Russian reversion of what had been an English retelling of Russian memories in the first place proved to be a diabolical task. But some consolation was given me by the thoughts that such multiple metamorphosis, familiar to butterflies, had not been tried by any human before. Among the anomalies of a memory whose possessor and victim should never have tried to become an autobiographer, the worst is the inclination to equate in retrospect my age with that of the century. This has led to a series of remarkably consistent chronological blunders in the first version of this book. I was born in April 1899, and naturally during the first third of, say, 1903, was roughly 3 years old. But in the August of that year, the sharp 3 revealed to me, as described in perfect past, should refer to the century's age, not to mine, which was 4, and as square and resilient as a rubber pillow. Similarly, the early summer of 1906, the summer I began to collect butterflies, I was 7 and not 6, as stated initially in the catastrophic second paragraph of Chapter 6. Mnemosyne, one must admit, has shown herself to be a very careless girl. All dates are given in the new style. We lagged 12 days behind the rest of civilized world, and in the 19th century, and 13 in the beginning of the 20th. By the old style, I was born on April 10 at daybreak in the last year of the last century, and that was if I could have been whisked across the border at once, April 22 in, say, Germany. But since all my birthdays were celebrated with diminishing pomp in the 20th century, everybody, including myself, upon being shifted by revolution and expatriation from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian, used to add 13 instead of 12 days to the 10th of April. The error is serious. What is to be done? I find April 23 under birth date in my most recent passport, which is also the birth date of Shakespeare, my nephew Vladimir, Sikorsky, Shirley Temple, and Hazel Brown, who moreover shares my passport. This, then, is the problem. Calculatory ineptitude prevents me from trying to solve it. When after 20 years of absence I sailed back to Europe, I renewed ties that had been undone even before I had left it. At these family reunions, speak memory was judged. Details of date and circumstance were checked, and it was found that in many cases I had erred, or had not examined deeply enough an obscure but fathomable recollection. Certain matters were dismissed by my advisers as legends or rumors, or if genuine, were proven to be related to events or periods other than those to which frail memory had attached them. My cousin Sergei Sergeyevich Nabokov gave me invaluable information on the history of our family. Both my sisters angrily remonstrated against my description of the journey to Biarritz, beginning of chapter 7, and by pelting me with specific details convinced me I had been wrong in leaving them behind, with nurses and aunts. What I still have not been able to rework. Through want of specific documentation, I have now preferred to delete for the sake of overall truth. On the other hand, a number of facts relating to ancestors and other personages have come to light and have been incorporated in this final version of Speak Memory. I hope to write someday a Speak On Memory, covering the years 1940 to 1960 spent in America. The evaporation of certain volatiles and the melting of certain metals are still going on in my coils and crucibles. The reader will find in the present work scattered references to my novels, but on the whole I felt the trouble of writing them had been enough, and that they should remain in their first stomach. My recent introductions to the English translations of Zashita Luzhina, 1930, The Defense, Putnam, 1964, Oktayani, 1936, Despair, Putnam, 1966, Priglashny Nakaj, 1938, Invitation to a Beheading, Putnam, 1959, Dar, 1952, Serialized, 1937 to 1938, The Gift, Putnam, 1963, and Solgatate, 1938, The Eye, Phaedra, 1965, give a sufficiently detailed and racy account of the creative part of my European past. For those who would like a fuller list of my publications, there is a detailed biography worked out by Dieter E. Zimmer, Vladimir Nabokov, Bibliography des Gymnastwerks, Roholt, first edition, December 1963, second revised edition, May 1964. The two-mover described in the last chapter has been republished in Chess Problems by Lipton, Matthews, and Rice, Faber, London, 1963, page 252. My most amusing invention, however, is a white retracts move problem, which I dedicated to E. A. Znosko-Borovsky, who published it in the 1930s, 1934, in the Immigré Daily Postieni Novosti, Paris. I do not recall the position lucidly enough to notate it here, but perhaps some lover of fairy chess, to which type of problem it belongs, will look it up in some day in one of those blessed libraries where old newspapers are microfilmed, as all our memories should be. Reviewers read the first version more carelessly than they will this new edition. Only one of them noticed my vicious snap at Freud in the first paragraph of Chapter 8, Section 2, and none discovered the name of a great cartoonist in tribute to him in the last sentence of Section 2 of Chapter 11. It is most embarrassing for a writer to have to point out such things himself. To avoid hurting the living or distressing the dead, certain proper names have been changed. These are set off by quotation marks in the index. Its main purpose is to list for my convenience some of the people and themes connected with my past years. Its presence will annoy the vulgar, but may please the discerning, if only because through the window of that index climbs a rose, and sometimes a gentle wind ex ponto blows. Vladimir Nabokov, January 5th, 1966, Montreux. And here's a map. I want to. Okay. I'm not sure you'll be able to see this very well. Okay. Sketch map of the Nabokov lands in the St. Petersburg region. Ooh. Okay. This photograph, taken in 1955 by an obliging American tourist, shows the Nabokov house of pink granite with frescoes and other Italianate ornaments in St. Petersburg, now Leningrad, 47, Morskaya, now Herzen Street. Alexander Ivanovich Herzen, 1812-1870, was a famous liberal whom this commemoration by a police state would hardly have gratified, as well as the talented author of Bilo et Dumi, translatable as Bygones and Meditations, one of my father's favorite books. My room was on the third floor above the Oriel. The lindens lining the street did not exist. Those green upstarts now hide the second floor east corner window of the room where I was born. Other nationalization, the house accommodated the Danish mission and later School of Architecture. The little sedan at the curb belongs presumably to the photographer. 1. The cradle rocks above an abyss, and common sense tells us that our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities in darkness. Although the two are identical twins, man as a rule views the prenatal abyss with more calm than the one he is heading for, at some 4,500 heartbeats an hour. I know, however, of a young chronophobiac who experienced something like panic when looking for the first time at homemade movies that had been taken a few weeks before his birth. He saw a world that was practically unchanged, the same house, the same people, and then realized that he did not exist there at all, and that nobody mentioned his absence. He caught a glimpse of his mother waving from an upstairs window, and that unfamiliar gesture disturbed him, as if it were some mysterious farewell. But what particularly frightened him was the sight of a brand-new baby carriage standing there on the porch, with the smug, encroaching air of a coffin. Even that was empty, as if in the reverse course of events his very bones had disintegrated. Such fancies are not foreign to young lives, or to put it otherwise, first and last things often tend to have an adolescent note, unless, probably, they are directed by some venerable and rigid religion. Nature expects a full-grown man to accept the two black voids fore and aft as stolidly as he accepts the extraordinary visions in between. Imagination, the supreme delight of the immortal and the immature, should be limited. In order to enjoy life, we should not enjoy it too much. I rebel against this state of affairs. I feel the urge to take my rebellion outside and pick at nature. Over and over again my mind has made colossal efforts to distinguish the faintest of personal glimmers in the impersonal darkness on both sides of my life. That this darkness is caused merely by the walls of time separating me and my bruised fists from the free world of timelessness is a relief I gladly share with the most gaudily painted savage. I have journeyed back in thought, with thought hopelessly tapering off as I went, to remote regions where I groped for some secret outlet, only to discover that the prison of time is spherical and without exits. Short of suicide, I have tried everything. I have doffed my identity in order to pass for a conventional spook and steal into realms that existed before I was conceived. I have mentally endured the degrading company of Victorian lady novelists and retired colonels, who remembered having in former lives been slave messengers on a Roman road, or sages under the willows of Lasha. I have ransacked my oldest dreams for keys and clues. Let me say at once that I reject completely the vulgar, shabby, fundamentally medieval world of Freud, with its crankish quest for sexual symbols, something like searching for a Baconian acrostics in Shakespeare's works, and its bitter little embryos spying from their natural nooks upon the love life of their parents. Initially, I was unaware that time, so boundless at first blush, was a prison. In probing my childhood, where is the next best to probing one's eternity, I see the awakening of consciousness as a series of spaced flashes, with the intervals between them gradually diminishing until bright blocks of perception are formed, affording memory a slippery hold. I learned numbers and speech more or less simultaneously at a very early date, but the inner knowledge that I was I, and that my parents were my parents, seems to have been established only later, when it was directly associated with my discovering their age in relation to mine. Judging by the strong sunlight that, when I think of that revelation, immediately invades my memory with the lobed sunflecks through the overlapping patterns of greenery, the occasion may have been my mother's birthday, in late summer, in the country, and I had asked questions and had assessed the answers I received. All this is as it should be, according to the theory of recapitulation. The beginning of reflexive consciousness in the brain of our remotest ancestor must surely have coincided with the dawning of the sense of time. Thus, when the newly disclosed fresh and trim formula of my own age, 4, was confronted with the parental formulas 33 and 27, something happened to me. I was given a tremendously invigorating shock, as if subjected to a second baptism, or more divine lines than the Greek Catholic ducking undergone 50 months earlier by a howling, half-drowned, half-victor, my mother, through the half-closed door, behind which an old custom bade parents retreat, managed to correct the bungling archpresbyter, Father Konstantin Vetvinitsky, I felt myself plunged abruptly into a radiant and mobile medium that was none other than the pure element of time. One shared it just as excited bathers share shining seawater with creatures that were not oneself but that were joined to one by time's common flow, an environment quite different from the spatial world, which not only man but apes and butterflies can perceive. At that instant I became acutely aware that the 27-year-old being in soft white and pink holding my left hand was my mother, and that the 33-year-old being in hard white and gold holding my right hand was my father. Between them, as they evenly progressed, I strutted and trotted and strutted again, from sunfleck to sunfleck, along the middle of a path which I easily identified today with an alley of ornamental oaklings in the park of our country estate, Vera, in the former province of St. Petersburg, Russia. Indeed, from my present ridge of remote, isolated, almost uninhabited time, I see my diminutive self as celebrating on that August day, 1903, the birth of sentient life. If my left-hand holder and my right-hand holder had both been present before in my vague infant world, they had been so under the mask of tender incognito. But now my father's attire, the resplendent uniform of the house guards, with that smooth golden swell of cuirass burning upon his chest and back, came out like the sun. And for several years afterward, I remained keenly interested in the age of my parents, and kept myself informed about it, like a nervous passenger asking the time in order to check a new watch. My father, let it be noted, had severed his term of military training long before I was born, so I suppose he had had that day put on the trappings of his old regiments as a festive joke. To a joke, then, I owe my first gleam of complete consciousness, which again was recapitulatory in implications, since the first creatures on earth to become aware of time were also the first creatures to smile, too. It was the primordial cave, and not what Freudian mystics might suppose, that lay behind the games I played when I was 4. A big cretonne-covered divan, white with black trefoils, in one of the drawing rooms at Vera rises in my mind like some massive product of geological upheaval before the beginning of history. History begins with the promise of fair Greece not far from one end of this divan, where a large potted hydrangea shrub with pale blue blossoms and some greenish ones half conceals in a corner of the room the pedestal of a marble bust of Diana. On the wall against which the divan stands, another phase of history is marked by a great engraving in an ebony frame of one of those Napoleonic battle pictures in which the episodic and the allegoric are the real adversaries, and where one sees all grouped together on the same plane of vision, a wounded drummer, a dead horse, trophies, one soldier about to bayonet another, and the invulnerable emperor posing with his generals amid the frozen fray. With the help of some grown-up person, who would use first both hands and then a powerful leg, the divan would be moved several inches away from the wall so as to form a narrow passage which I would be further helped to roof snugly with the divan's bolsters and close up the ends with a couple of its cushions. I then had the fantastic pleasure of creeping through that pitch-dark tunnel where I lingered a little to listen to the singing in my ears, that lonesome vibration so familiar to small boys in dusty hiding places, and then, in a burst of delicious panic on rapidly fanning hands and knees, I would reach the tunnel's far end, push its cushion away, and be welcomed by a mesh of sunshine on the parquet under the cranework of a Viennese chair and 2 gamesome flies, settling by turns. A dreamier and more delicate sensation was provided by another cave game, when upon awakening in the early morning I made a tent of my bedclothes and let my imagination play in 1,000 dim ways, with shadowy snowslides of linen, and with the faint light that seemed to penetrate my penumbral covert from some immense distance, where I fancied that strange pale animals roamed in a landscape of lakes. The recollection of my crib with its lateral nets of fluffy cotton cords brings back too the pleasure of handling a certain beautiful, delightfully solid, garnet dark crystal egg left over from some unremembered Easter. I used to chew a corner of the bedsheet until it was thoroughly soaked, and then wrap the egg in it tightly so as to admire and relick the warm ruddy glitter of the snugly enveloped facets, and then came seeping through with a miraculous completeness of glow and color. But that was not yet the closest I got to feeding upon beauty. How small the cosmos, a kangaroo's pouch, would hold it, how paltry and puny in comparison to human consciousness, to a single individual recollection and its expression in words. I may be inordinately fond of my earliest impressions, but then I have reason to be grateful to them. They led the way to a veritable Eden of visual and tactile sensations. One night, during a trip abroad, in the fall of 1903, I recall kneeling on my flattish pillow at the window of a sleeping car, probably the long-extinct Mediterranean train de luxe, the one whose 6 cars had the lower part of their body painted in umber and the panels in cream, and seeing with inexplicable pang a handful of fabulous lights that beckoned to me from a distant hillside, and then slipped into a pocket of black velvet diamonds that I later gave away to my characters to alleviate the burden of my wealth. I had probably managed to undo and push up the tight-tooled blind at the head of my berth, and my heels were cold, but I still kept kneeling and peering. Nothing is sweeter or stranger than to ponder those first thrills. They belong to the harmonious world of a perfect child, and as such possess a naturally plastic form in one's memory, which can be set down with hardly any effort. It is only starting with the recollections of one's adolescence that mimicine begins to get choosy and crabbed. I would moreover submit that in regard to the power of hoarding up impressions, Russian children of my generation pass through a period of genius, as if destiny were loyally trying what it could for them, by giving them more than their share, in view of the cataclysm that was to remove completely the world they had known. Genius disappeared when everything had been stored, just as it does with those other, more specialized child prodigies, pretty curly-headed youngsters waving batons or taming enormous pianos, who eventually turn into second-rate musicians with sad eyes and obscure elements and something vaguely misshapen about their inochoid hindquarters. But even so, the individual mystery remains to tantalize the memoirist. Neither in environment nor in heredity can I find the exact instrument that fashioned me, the anonymous roller that pressed upon my life a certain intricate watermark, whose unique design becomes visible when the lamp of art is made to shine through life's foolscap. 3. To fix correctly in terms of time some of my childhood recollections, I have to go by comets and eclipses, as historians do when they tackle the fragments of a saga. But in other cases there is no dearth of data. I see myself, for instance, clambering over wet black rocks at the seaside while Miss Norcott, a languid and melancholy governess, who thinks I am following her, strolls away along the curved beach with Sergei, my younger brother. I am wearing a toy bracelet. As I crawl over those rocks, I keep repeating in a kind of zestful, copious, and deeply gratifying incantation the English word childhood, which sounds mysterious and new, and becomes stranger and stranger as it gets mixed up in my small, overstocked, hectic mind with Robin Hood and Little Red Riding Hood and the brown hoods of old hunchbacked fairies. There are dimples in the rocks full of tepid sea-water, and my magic muttering accompanies certain spells I am weaving over the tiny sapphire pools. The place is, of course, Abbazzia, or the Adriatic. The thing around my wrist looking like a fancy napkin ring, made of semi-translucent, pale green and pink celluloidish stuff, is the fruit of a Christmas tree which Anya, a pretty cousin, my coeval, gave me in St. Petersburg a few months before. I sentimentally treasured it until it developed dark streaks inside which I decided, as in a dream, were my hair cuttings, which somehow had got into the shiny substance, together with my tears during a dreadful visit to a hated hairdresser in nearby Fiume. On the same day, a waterside cafe, my father happened to notice, just as we were being served, 2 Japanese officers at a table near us, and we immediately left, not without my hastily snatching a whole bomb of lemon sherbet, which I carried away secreted in my aching mouth. The year was 1904. I was 5. Russia was fighting Japan. With hearty relish, the English Illustrated Weekly, Miss Norcott, subscribed to reproduced war pictures by Japanese artists that showed how the Russian locomotives, made singularly toy-like by the Japanese pictorial style, would drown if our army tried to lay rails across the treacherous ice of Lake Baikal. But let me see. I had an even earlier association with that war. One afternoon at the beginning of that same year, in our St. Petersburg house, I was led down from the nursery into my father's study to say how do you do to a friend of the family, General Kuropatkin. His thick-set uniform encased body creaking slightly, he spread out to amuse me a handful of matches on the divan where he was sitting, placed 10 of them end to end to make a horizontal line, and said, "This is the sea in calm weather." Then he tipped up each pair so as to turn the straight line into a zigzag, and that was a stormy sea. He scrambled the matches and was about to do, I hoped, a better trick when we were interrupted. His aide-de-camp was shown in and said something to him. With a Russian flustered grunt, Kuropatkin heavily rose from his seat, the loose matches jumping up in the divan as his weight left it. That day he had been ordered to assume supreme command of the Russian army in the Far East. This incident had a special sequel 15 years later, when at a certain point in my father's flight from Bolshevik-held St. Petersburg to southern Russia, he was accosted while crossing a bridge and by an old man who looked like a gray-bearded peasant in a sheepskin coat. He asked my father for a light. The next moment each recognized the other. I hope old Kuropatkin, in his rustic disguise, managed to evade Soviet imprisonment, but that is not the point. What pleases me is the evolution of the match theme. Those magic ones he had shown me had been trifled with and mislaid, and his armies had also vanished, and everything had fallen through like my toy trains that in the winter of 1904-1905 in Wiesbaden I tried to run over the frozen puddles in the grounds of Hotel Oranian. The following of such thematic designs through one's life should be, I think, the true purpose of autobiography. 4. The close of Russia's disastrous campaign in the Far East was accompanied by furious internal disorders. Undaunted by them, my mother, with her 3 children, returned to St. Petersburg after almost a year of foreign resorts. This was in the beginning of 1905. State matters required the presence of my father in the capital. The Constitutionalist Democratic Party, of which he was one of the founders, was to win a majority of seats in the first parliament the following year. During one of his short stays with us in the country that summer, he ascertained with patriotic dismay that my brother and I could read and write English but not Russian except Kakao and Mama. It was decided that the village schoolmaster should come every afternoon to give us lessons and take us for walks. With a sharp and merry blast from the whistle that was part of my first sailor suit, my childhood calls me back into that distant past to have me shake hands again with my delightful teacher. Vasily Martinovich Zhernosikov had a fuzzy brown beard, a balding head, and china blue eyes, one of which bore a fascinating excrescence on the upper lid. The first day he came, he brought a box full of tremendously appetizing blocks with a different letter painted on each side. These cubes he would manipulate as if they were infinitely precious things, which, for that matter, they were, besides forming splendid tunnels for toy trains. He revered my father, who had secretly rebuilt the modernized village school, an old-fashioned token of free thought. He sported a flowing black tie, carelessly knotted in a bow-like arrangement. When addressing me as a small boy, he used the plural of the second person, not in the stiff way servants did, and not as my mother would do in moments of intense tenderness when my temperature had gone up or I had lost a tiny train passenger, as if the singular were too thin to bear the load of her love, but with the polite plainness of one man speaking to another, whom he does not know well enough to use thou. A fiery revolutionary, he would gesture vehemently in our country rambles and speak humanity and freedom and the badness of warfare and the sad but interesting, I thought, necessity of blowing up tyrants, and sometimes he would produce the then popular pacifist book Doloi Oružje, a translation of Bertha von Sutter's Die Waffen Nieder, and treat me, a child of 6, to tedious quotations. I tried to refute them. At that tender and bellicose age, I spoke up for bloodshed in any angry defense of my world of toy pistols and Arthurian knights. Under Lenin's regime, when all the non-communist radicals were ruthlessly persecuted, Zhernosikov was sent to a hard labor camp but managed to escape abroad and died in Narva in 1939. To him, in a way, I owe the ability to continue for another stretch along my private footpath which runs parallel to the road of that troubled decade. When in July 1906 the Tsar unconstitutionally dissolved the parliament, a number of its members, my father among them, held a rebellious session in Viborg and issued a manifesto that urged the people to resist the government. For this, more than a year and a half later, they were imprisoned. My father spent a restful if somewhat lonesome 3 months in solitary confinement, with his books, his collapsible bathtub, his copy of J.P. Muller's Manual of Home Gymnastics. To the end of her days, my mother preserved the letters he managed to smuggle through to her, cheerful epistles written in pencil on toilet paper. These I had published in 1965 in the 4th issue of the Russian-language review Vozdushnie Puti, edited by Roman Grinberg in New York. We were in the country when he regained his liberty, and it was the village schoolmaster who directed the festivities and arranged the bunting, some of it frankly read, to greet my father on his way home from the railway station. Under archivolts of fir needles and crowns of bluebottles, my father's favorite flower, we children had gone down to the village, and it is when I recall that particular day that I see with the utmost clarity the sun-spangled river, the bridge, the dazzling tin of a can left by a fisherman on its wooden railing, the linden-treed hill with its rosy-red church and the marble mausoleum where my mother's dead reposed, the dusty road to the village, the strip of short pastel-green grass with bald patches of sandy soil between the road and the lilac bushes, behind which walled, mossy log cabins stood in a rickety row, the stone building of the new schoolhouse near the wooden old one, and as we swiftly drove by, the little black dog with the very white teeth that dashed out from among the cottages at a terrific pace but in absolute silence, saving his voice for the brief outburst he would enjoy when his muted spurt would at last bring him close to the speeding carriage. 5. The old and the new, the liberal touch and the patriarchal one, fatal poverty and fatalistic wealth got fantastically interwoven in that strange first decade of our century. Several times during a summer it might happen in the middle of a luncheon in the bright, many-windowed, walnut-paneled dining room on the first floor of Ivera Manor. Alexei, the butler, with an unhappy expression on his face, would bend over and inform my father in a low voice, especially low if we had company, that a group of villagers wanted to see the Baron outside. Briskly, my father would remove his napkin from his lap and ask my mother to excuse him. One of the windows at the west end of the dining room gave upon a portion of the drive near the main entrance. One could see the top of the honeysuckle bushes opposite the porch. From that direction the courteous buzz of a peasant welcome would reach us, and the inevitable group greeted by my invisible father. The ensuing parley, conducted in ordinary tones, would not be heard, and the windows underneath which it took place were closed to keep out the heat. It presumably had to do with a plea for his meditation in some local feud, or with some special subsidy, or with the permission to harvest some bit of our land, or cut down a coveted clump of our trees. If, as usually happened, the request was at once granted, there would be again that buzz, and then in token of gratitude the good Baron would be put through the national ordeal of being rocked and tossed up by securely caught by a score or so of strong arms. In the dining room, my brother and I would be told to go on with our food. My mother, a tidbit between finger and thumb, would glance under the table to see if her nervous and gruff dachshund was there. Un jour ils vont le laisser tomber would come from the Mia Gourlet, a primly pessimistic old lady who had been my mother's governess and still dwelt with us on awful terms with our own governess. From my place at the table I would suddenly see through one of the west windows a marvelous case of levitation. There, for an instant, the figure of my father in his wind-rippled white summer suit would be displayed gloriously sprawling in mid-air, his limbs in a curiously casual attitude, his handsome, imperturbable features turned to the sky. Thrice to the mighty heave-ho of his invisible tossers, he would fly up in this fashion, and the second time he would go higher than the first, and then there would be, on his last and loftiest flight, reclining as if for good, against the cobalt blue of the summer noon, like one of those paradisiac personages who comfortably soar, with such a wealth of folds in their garments, on the vaulted ceiling of a church, while below, one by one, the wax tapers and mortal hands light up to make a swarm of minute flames in the midst of incense, and the priest's chants of eternal repose and funeral lilies conceal the face of whoever lies there among the swimming lights in the open coffin. 2. As far back as I remember myself, with interest, with amusement, seldom with admiration or disgust, I have been subject to mild hallucinations. Some are aural, others are optical, and by none have I profited much. The fatidic accents that restrained Socrates or egged on Jonetta Dark have degenerated with me to the level of something one happens to hear between lifting and clapping down the receiver of a busy party line telephone. Just before falling asleep, I often became aware of a kind of one-sided conversation going on in an adjacent section of my mind, quite independently from the actual trend of my thoughts. It is a neutral, detached, anonymous voice which I catch saying words of no importance to me whatever, an English or a Russian sentence, not even addressed to me, and so trivial that I hardly dare give samples, lest the flatness I wish to convey be marred by a molehill of sense. This silly phenomenon seems to be the auditory counterpart of certain predormitory visions, which I also know well. What I mean is not the bright mental image, as for instance the face of a beloved parent long dead conjured up by a wing stroke of the will. That is one of the bravest movements a human spirit can make. Nor am I alluding to the so-called muscae volitants, shadows cast upon the retinal rods by motes of the vitreous humor, which are seen as transparent threads drifting across the visual field. Perhaps nearer to the hypnagogic mirages I am thinking of is the colored spot, the stab of an after-image, with which the lamp one has just turned off wounds the palpebral night. However, a shock of this sort is not really a necessary starting point for the steady development of the visions that pass before my closed eyes. They come and go without the drowsy observer's participation, but are essentially different from dream pictures, for he is still master of his senses. They are often grotesque. I am pestered by roguish profiles, by some coarse-featured and florid dwarf with a swelling nostril or ear. At times, however, my photisms take on a rather soothing flow quality, and then I see, projected as it were upon the inside of the eyelid, grey figures walking between beehives, or small black parrots gradually vanishing among mountain snows, or a mauve remoteness melting beyond moving masts. On top of all this, I present a fine case of colored hearing. Perhaps hearing is not quite accurate, since the color sensation seems to be produced by the very act of my orally forming a given letter while I imagine its outline, the long A of the English alphabet, and it is this alphabet I have in mind. Farther on, unless otherwise stated, has for me the tint of weathered wood. But a French A evokes polished ebony. This black group also includes hard G, vulcanized rubber, and R, a sooty rag being ripped, oatmeal N, noodle lamp L, and the ivory-backed hand mirror of O take care of the whites. I am puzzled by my French on, which I see as the beginning tension surface of alcohol in a small glass. Passing on to the blue group, there is steely X, thundercloud Z, and huckleberry K. Since a subtle interaction exists between sound and shape, I see Q as browner than K, while S is not the light blue of C, but a curious mixture of azure and mother of pearl. Adjacent tints do not merge, and diphthongs do not have special colors of their own, unless represented by a single character in some other language. Thus, for the fluffy gray, three-stemmed Russian letter that stands for sh, a letter as old as the rushes of the Nile, influences its English representation. I hasten to complete my list before I am interrupted. In the green group, there are alderleaf F, the unripe apple of P, the pistachio T, dull green combined somehow with violet, is the best I can do for W. The yellows comprise various E's and I's, creamy D, bright golden Y, and U, whose alphabetical value I can express only by brassy with an olive sheen. In the brown group, there are the rich rubbery tone of soft G, paler J, and the drab shoelace of H. Finally, among the reds, B has the tone called burnt sienna by painters. M is a fold of pink flannel, and today I have at last perfectly matched V with rose quartz in Merritt's and Paul's Dictionary of Color. The word for rainbow, a primary but decidedly muddy rainbow, is in my private language the hardly pronounceable Kishrug. The first author to discuss audition coloré was, as far as I know, an albino physician in 1812 in Erlangen. The confessions of a synthesis that must sound tedious and pretentious to those who are protected from such leakings and drafts by mere solid walls than mine are. To my mother, though, this all seemed quite normal. So the matter came up one day in my 7th year, as I was using a heap of old alphabet blocks to build a tower. I casually remarked to her that their colors were all wrong. We discovered then that some of their letters had the same tint as mine, and that besides, she was optically affected by musical notes. These evoked no chromatisms in me whatsoever. Music, I regret to say, affects me merely as an ordinary succession of more or less irritating sounds. Under certain emotional circumstances, I can stand the spasms of a rich violin, but the concert piano and all wind instruments bore me in small doses and flay me in larger ones. Despite the number of operas I was exposed to every winter, I must have attended Ruslan and Bukovaya Dama at least a dozen times in the course or half as many years. My weak responsiveness to music was completely overrun by the visual torment of not being able to read over Piemann's shoulder, or of trying in vain to imagine the hawk moths in the dim bloom of Juliet's garden. My mother did everything to encourage the general sensitiveness I had to visual stimulation. How many were the aquarelles she painted for me? What a revolution it was when she showed me the lilac tree that grows out of mixed blue and red, sometimes in our St. Petersburg house from a secret compartment in the wall of her dressing room. In my birth-room, she would produce a mass of jewelry for my bedtime amusement. I was very small then, and those flashes of tiaras and chokers and rings seemed to me hardly inferior in mystery and enchantment to the illumination of the city during imperial fêtes, when in the padded stillness of a frosty night, giant monograms, crowns, and other armorial designs made of colored electric bulbs, sapphire, emerald, ruby, glowed with a kind of charmed constraint above snow-lined cornices on house fronts along residential streets. My numerous childhood illnesses brought my mother and me still closer together. As a little boy, I showed an abnormal aptitude for mathematics, which I completely lost in my singular talentless youth. This gift played a horrible part in tussles with quinsy or scarlet fever, when I felt enormous spheres and huge numbers swell relentlessly in my aching brain. A foolish tutor had explained logarithms to me much too early, and I had read in a British publication, the boy's own paper, I believe, about a certain Hindu calculator who in exactly 2 seconds could find the 17th root of, say, 352975132 I am not sure I have got this right. Anyway, the root was 212. Such were the monsters that thrived on my delirium, and the only way to prevent them from crowding me out of myself was to kill them by extracting their hearts. But they were far too strong, and I would sit up and laboriously form garbled sentences as I tried to explain things to my mother. Beneath my delirium, she recognized sensations she had known herself, and her understanding would bring my expanding universe back to a Newtonian norm. The future specialist in such dull literary lore as autoplagiarism would like to collate a protagonist's experience in my novel The Gift with the original event. One day, after a long illness, as I lay in bed, still very weak, I found myself basking in an unusual euphoria of lightness and repose. I knew my mother had gone to buy me the daily present that made the convalescences so delightful. What it would be this time I could not guess, but through the crystal of my strangely translucent state, I vividly visualized her driving away down Morskaya Street toward Nevsky Avenue. I distinguished the light sleigh drawn by a chestnut courser. I heard his snorting breath, the rhythmic clacking of his scrotum, and the lumps of frozen earth and snow thudding against the front of the sleigh before my eyes and before those of my mother loomed the hind part of the coachman in his heavily padded blue robe, and the leather-encased watch, 20 minutes past 2, strapped to the back of his belt, from under which curved the pumpkin-like folds of his huge stuffed rump. I saw my mother's seal furs, and as the icy speed increased, the muff she raised to her face, that graceful winter ride gesture of a St. Petersburg lady. 2 corners of the voluminous spread of bearskin that covered her up to the waist were attached by loops to the 2 side knobs of the low back of her seat, and behind her, holding on to these knobs, a footman in a cockaded hat stood on his narrow support above the rear extremities of the runners. Still watching the sleigh, I saw it stop at Truman's. Writing implements, bronze baubles, playing cards. Presently my mother came out of the shop, followed by the footman. He carried her purchase, which looked to me like a pencil. I was astonished that she did not carry so small an object herself, and this disagreeable question of dimensions caused a faint renewal, fortunately very brief, of the mind-dilation effect, which I hoped had gone with the fever. As she was being tucked up again in the sleigh, I watched the vapor exhaled by all, horse included. I watched, too, the familiar pouting movement she made to distend the network of her close-fitting veil, drawn too tight over her face. As I write this, the touch of reticulated tenderness that my lips used to feel when I kissed her veiled cheek comes back to me, flies back to me, with a shout of joy out of the blue windowed. The curtains are not yet drawn past. A few minutes later she entered my room. In her arms she held a big parcel. It had been, in my vision, greatly reduced in size, perhaps because I subliminally corrected what logic warned me might still be the dreaded remnants of delirium's dilating world. Now the object proved to be a giant polygonal Faber pencil, 4 feet long and correspondingly thick. It had been hanging as a showpiece in the shop's window, and she presumed I had coveted it, as I coveted all things that were not quite purchasable. The shopman had been obliged to ring up an agent, a Dr. Libner, as if the transaction possessed indeed some pathological import. For an awful moment I wondered whether the point was made of real graphite. It was, and some years later I satisfied myself, by drilling a hole in the side, that the lead went right through the whole length, a perfect case of art for art's sake on the part of Faber and Dr. Libner, since the pencil was far too big for use, and indeed was not meant to be used. "Oh, yes," she would say, as I mentioned this or that unusual sensation, "yes, I know all that," and with a somewhat eerie ingenuousness she would discuss such things as double sight, and little raps in the woodwork of tripod tables, and premonitions of the feeling of déjà vu. A streak of sectarianism ran through her direct ancestry. She went to church only at Lent and Easter. The schismatic move revealed itself in her healthy distaste for the ritual of the Greek Catholic Church and for its priests. She found a deep appeal in the moral and poetical side of the Gospels, but felt no need in the support of any dogma. The appalling insecurity of afterlife and its lack of privacy did not enter her thoughts. Her intense and pure religiousness took the form of her having equal faith in the existence of another world, and in the impossibility of comprehending it in terms of earthly life. All one could do is glimpse, amid the haze and the chimeras, something real ahead, just as persons endowed with an unusual persistence of diurnal celebration are able to perceive in their deepest sleep, somewhere beyond the throes of an entangled and inept nightmare, the ordered reality of the waking hour. To love with all one's soul and leave for the rest to fate was the simple rule she heeded. "Vot zapomni." Now remember, she would say in conspiratorial tones as she drew my attention to this or that loved thing in Vera. A lark ascending the curds and whey sky of a dull spring day, heat lightning taking pictures of distant line of trees in the night, the palette of maple leaves on brown sand, a small bird's cunate footprints in the new snow. As if feeling that in a few years the tangible part of her world would perish, she cultivated an extraordinary consciousness of the various time marks distributed throughout our country place. She cherished her own past with the same retrospective fervor that I now do her image in my past. Thus, in a way, I inherited an exquisite simulacrum, the beauty of intangible property, unreal estate. And this proved a splendid training for endurance of later losses. Her special tags and imprints became as dear, as sacred to me as they were to her. There was the room which in the past had been reserved for her mother's pet hobby, a chemical laboratory. There was the linden tree marking the spot by the side of the road that sloped up toward the village of Gryazno, accented on the ultima. At the steepest bit, where one preferred to take one's bike by the horns, Bika Zaroka, as my father, a dedicated cyclist, liked to say, and where he had proposed, and there was, in the so-called Old Park, the obsolete tennis court, now a region of moss, mole heaps, and mushrooms, which had been the scene of gay rallies in the 80s and 90s. Even her grim father would shed his coat and give the heaviest racket an abrasive shake, but which, by the time I was 10, nature had effaced with the thoroughness of a felt eraser wiping out a geometrical problem. By then, an excellent modern court had been built at the end of the new part of the parks by skilled workmen imported from Poland for that purpose. The wire mesh of an ample enclosure separated it from the flowery meadow that framed its clay. After a damp night, the surface acquired a brownish gloss, and the white lines would be repainted with liquid chalk from a green pail by Dmitri, the smallest and oldest of our gardeners, a meek, black-booted, red-shirted dwarf, slowly retreating all hunched up as his paintbrush went down the line. A petri hedge, the yellow acacia of northern Russia, with a midway opening corresponding to the court screen door, ran parallel to the enclosure and to a path dubbed Tropinka Sphinxov, path of Sphinxids, because of the hawk moths visiting at the dusk of fluffy lilacs along the border that faced the hedge and likewise broke in the middle. This path formed the bar of a great T, whose vertical was the alley of slender oaks, my mother's coeval that traversed, and as already said, the new park through its entire length. Looking down that avenue from the base of the T near the drive, one could make out quite distinctly the bright little gap 500 yards away, or 50 years away, from where I am now. Our current tutor, or my father, when he stayed with us in the country, invariably had my brother for a partner in our temperamental family doubles. "Play," my mother would cry in the old manner as she put her little foot forward and bent her white-hatted head to ladle out an assiduous but feeble serve. I got easily cross with her, and she, with the ball boys, two barefooted peasant lads, Dmitri's pug-nosed grandson and the twin brother of pretty Polinka, the head coachman's daughter. The northern summer became tropical around harvest time. Scarlet Sergei would stick his racket between his knees and laboriously wipe his glasses. I see my butterfly net propped against the enclosure, just in case. Wallace Meyer's book on lawn tennis lies open on a bench, and after every exchange my father, a first-rate player, with a cannonball service of the Frank Risley type and a beautiful lifting drive, pedantically inquires of my brother and me whether the follow-through, the state of grace, has descended upon us, and sometimes a prodigious cloudburst would cause us to huddle under a shelter at the corner of the court, where old Dmitri would be sent to fetch umbrellas and raincoats for the house. A quarter of an hour later, he would reappear under a mountain of clothing in the vista of the long avenue, which, to his advanced, would regain its leopard spots with the sun blazing anew and his huge burden unneeded. She loved all games of skill and gambling. Under her expert hands, the 1,000 bits of jigsaw puzzle gradually formed an English hunting scene. What had seemed to be the limb of a horse would turn out to belong to an elm, and the hitherto unplaceable piece would snugly fill up a gap in the mottled background, affording one the delicate thrill of an abstract and yet tactile satisfaction. At one time she was very fond of poker, which had reached St. Petersburg society via diplomatic circles, so that some of the combinations came with pretty French names: Berlin for three of a kind, Curlin for flush, and so on. The game in use was the regular draw poker, with occasionally the additional jingle of jackpots and an omnivorous joker. In town she often played poker at the houses of friends until 3 in the morning, a society recreation in the last years before World War I, and later in exile she used to imagine with the same wonder and dismay with which she recalled old Dmitri, the chauffeur Pirogov, who still seemed to be waiting for her in the relentless frost of an unending night, although in his case rum-laced tea and a hospitable kitchen must have gone a long way to assuage those vigils. One of her greatest pleasures in summer was the very Russian sport of holdit pogrebi, looking for mushrooms. Fried in butter and thickened with sour cream, her delicious finds appeared regularly on the dinner table. Not that the gustatory moment mattered much. Her main delight was in the quest, and this quest had its rules. Thus no agarics were taken. All she picked were species belonging to the edible section of the genus Boletus, tawny edulus, brown scaber, red aurantiacus, and a few close allies, called tube mushrooms by some, and coldly defined by mycologists as terrestrial, fleshy, putrescent, centrally stibitate fungi, or fungi. Their compact pillae, tight-fitting in infant plants, robust and appetizingly domed in ripe ones, have a smooth, not lamellate undersurface and a neat, strong stem. In classical simplicity of form, boletes differ considerably from the true mushroom, with its preposterous gills and effete steeple ring. It is, however, to the latter, to the lowly and ugly agarics, that nations with timorous taste buds limit their knowledge and appetite, so that to the Anglo-American, lay mid the aristocratic boletes are, at best, reformed toadstools. Rainy weather would bring out these beautiful plants in profusion under the firs, birches, aspens in our park, especially in its older part, east of the carriage road that divided the park in two. Its shady recesses within harbor that special boletic reek which makes a Russian's nostrils dilate, a dark, dank, satisfying blend of damp moss-rich earth, rotting leaves, that one had to poke and peer for a goodish while among the wet underwood before something really nice, such as a family of bonneted baby edulis or the marbled variety of scaber, could be discovered and carefully teased out of the soil. On overcast afternoons, all alone in the drizzle, my mother, still carrying a basket stained blue on the inside by somebody's whortleberries, would set out on the long collecting tour. Toward dinner time, she could be seen emerging from the nebulous depths of a park alley, her small figure cloaked and hooded in greenish-brown wool, on which countless droplets of moisture had made a kind of mist all around her. As she came nearer from under the dripping trees and caught sight of me, her face would show an odd, cheerless expression which might have spelled poor luck, but which I knew was the tense jealousy-contained beatitude of the successful hunter. Just before reaching me, with an abrupt, drooping movement of the arm and shoulder, and a poof of magnified exhaustion, she would let her basket sag in order to stress its weight, its fabulous fullness. Near a white garden bench, on a round garden table of iron, she would lay out her boletes in concentric circles to count and sort them. Old ones with spongy, dingy flesh would be eliminated, leaving the young and the crisp. For a moment, before they were bundled away by a servant to a place she knew nothing about, to a doom that did not interest her, she would stand there admiring them in a glow of quiet contentment. As often happened at the end of a rainy day, the sun might cast a lurid gleam before setting, and there, on the damp round table, her mushrooms would lie, very colorful, some bearing traces of extraneous vegetation, a grass blade sticking to a viscid fawn cap, or moss still clothing the bulbous base of a dark stippled stem, and a tiny looper caterpillar would be there too, measuring like a child's finger and thumb the rim of the table, and every now and then stretching upward to grope in vain for the shrub from which it had been dislodged. Not only were the kitchen and the servants' hall never visited by my mother, but they stood as far removed from her consciousness as if they were the corresponding quarters in a hotel. My father had no inclination either to run the house, but he did order the meals. With a little sigh, he would open a kind of album laid by the butler on the dinner table after dessert, and in his elegant flowing hand write down the menu for the following day. He had a peculiar habit of letting his pencil or fountain pen vibrate just above the paper, while he pondered the next ripple of words. My mother nodded a vague consent to his suggestions of maid of white face. Nominally, the housekeeping was in the hands of her former nurse, at that time a bleary, incredibly wrinkled old woman, born a slave around 1830, with the small face of a melancholy tortoise and a big shuffling feet. She wore a nunnish brown dress, and gave off a slight but unforgettable smell of coffee and decay. Her dreaded congratulation on our birthdays and name days was the serfage kiss on the shoulder. Age had developed in her a pathological stinginess, especially in regard to sugar and preserves, so that by degrees, and with the sanction of my parents, other domestic arrangements kept secret from her had quietly come into force. Without knowing it, the knowledge would have broken her heart. She remained dangling, as it were, from her own key-ring, while my mother did her best to allay with soothing words the suspicions that now and then flitted across the old woman's weakening mind. Sole mistress of her mouldy and remote little kingdom, which she thought was the real one, we would have starved had it been so. She was followed by the mocking glances of lackeys and maids. She steadily plodded through the long corridors to store away half an apple or a couple of broken petit beurre biscuits she had found on a plate. Meanwhile, with a permanent staff of about 50 servants and no questions asked, our city household and country place were the scenes of fantastic merry-go-round of theft, and this according to nosy old aunts whom nobody heeded but who proved to be right after all, the chief cook Nikolai Andreevich and the head gardener Igor, both staid-looking, bespectacled men with the hoary temples of a trusty retainers, were the two masterminds. When confronted with stupendous and incomprehensible bills, or a sudden extinction of garden strawberries or hothouse peaches, my father, a jurist and a statesman, felt professionally vexed at not being able to cope with the economics of his own home. But every time a complicated case of larceny came to light, some legal doubt or scruple prevented him from doing anything about it. When common sense required the firing of a rascally servant, the man's little son would as likely not fall desperately ill, and the resolution to get the best doctors in town for him would cancel all other considerations. So with one thing and another, my father preferred to leave the whole housekeeping situations in a state of precarious equilibrium, not devoid of a certain quiet humor, with my mother deriving considerable comfort in the hope that our old nurse's illusory world would not be shattered. My mother knew well how hurtful a broken illusion could be. The most trifling disappointment took on for her the dimensions of a major disaster. One Christmas Eve in Vera, not long before her fourth baby was to be born, she happened to be laid up with a slight ailment and made my brother and me, aged respectively 5 and 6, promise not to look into the Christmas stockings that we would find hanging from our bedposts on the following morning, but to bring them over to her room and investigate them there, so that she could watch and enjoy our pleasure. Upon awakening, I held a furtive conference with my brother, after which, with eager hands, each felt his delightfully crackling stocking stuffed with small presents. They were cautiously fished out one by one, undid the ribbons, loosened the tissue paper, inspected everything by the weak light that came through a chink in the shutters, wrapped up the little things again, and crammed them back where they had been. I next recall our sitting on our mother's bed, holding those lumpy stockings and doing our best to give the performance she had wanted to see, but we had so messed up the wrappings, so amateurish were our renderings of enthusiastic surprise. I can see my brother casting his eyes upward and exclaiming in imitation of our new French governess, "Ah, que c'est beau!" that after observing us for a moment, our audience burst into tears. A decade passed. World War I started. A crowd of patriots and my Uncle Ruka stoned the German embassy. Petersburg was sunk to Petrograd against all rules of nomenclatorial priority. Beethoven turned out to be Dutch. The newsreels showed photogenic explosions, the spasm of a cannon, Poincar and his leather leggings, bleak puddles, the poor little Tsarevich in Circassian uniform with dagger and cartridges, his tall sisters so dowdily dressed, long railway trains crammed with troops. My mother set up a private hospital for wounded soldiers. I remember her in the fashionable nurse's gray and white uniform she abhorred, denouncing with the same childish tears the impenetrable meekness of those crippled peasants and the ineffectiveness of part-time compassion. And still later, when in exile reviewing the past, she would often accuse herself, unjustly as I see it now, of having been less affected by the misery of man than by the emotional load man dumps upon innocent nature, old trees, old horses, old dogs. Her particular fondness for brown dachshunds puzzled my critical aunts. In the family albums illustrating her young years, there was hardly a group that did not include one such animal, usually with some part of its flexible body blurred, and always with strange paranoid eyes dachshunds have in snapshots. A couple of obese old-timers, Box and I, Lulu, still lolled in the sunshine on the porch when I was a child. Sometime in 1904, my father bought a dog show in Munich, a pup who grew into the bad-tempered but wonderfully handsome Trainee, as I named him because of his being as long and as brown as a sleeping car. And one of the musical themes of my childhood is Trainee's hysterical tongue on the trail of the hare he never got in the depths of Elvira Park, whence he would return at dusk after my anxious mother had stood whistling for a long time in the oak avenue, with the old corpse of a mole in his jaws and burrs in his ears. Around 1915 his hind legs became paralyzed, and until he was chloroformed, he would dismally drag himself over long glossy stretches of parquet floor, like a col de jatte. Then somebody gave us another pup, Box 2, whose grandparents had been Dr. Anton Chekhov, Kina, and Brom. This final dachshund followed us into exile, and as late as 1930 in a suburb of Prague, where my widowed mother spent her last years on a small pension provided by the Czech government, he could still be seen going for reluctant walks with his mistress, waddling far behind her in a huff, tremendously old and furious with his long Czech muzzle of wire, an emigre dog in a patched and ill-fitting coat. During our last 2 Cambridge years, my brother and I used to spend vacations in Berlin, where our parents with the 2 girls and the 10-year-old Kirill occupied one of those large, gloomy, eminently bourgeois apartments that I have led to so many emigre families in my novels and short stories. On the night of March 28, 1922, around 10 o'clock in the living room, where as usual my mother was reclining on the red plush corner couch, I happened to be reading to her Bloch's verse in Italy. Had just got to the end of the little poem about Florence, which Bloch compares to the delicate, smoky bloom of an iris, and she was saying over her knitting, Yes, Florence does look like a diminy iris. How true. I remember when the telephone rang. After 1923, when she moved to Prague, and I lived in Germany and France, I was unable to visit her frequently, nor was I with her at her death, which occurred on the eve of World War II. Whenever I did manage to go to Prague, there was always that initial pang one feels just before time, caught unawares, again dons its familiar mask. In the pitiable lodgings she shared with her dearest companion, Yevgenia Konstantinovna Hofield, 1884 to 1957, who had replaced in 1914 Miss Greenwood, who in her turn had replaced Miss Lavington as governess of my 2 sisters, Olga, born January 5, 1903, and Elena, born March 31st, 1906, albums in which during the last years she had copied out her favorite poems from Nabokov to Mayakovsky, lay around her on odds and ends of decrepit second-hand furniture, a cast of my father's hand and a watercolor picture of his grave in the Greek Catholic cemetery of Tegel, now in East Berlin, shared a shelf with emigre writers' books so prone to disintegration in their cheap paper covers. A soapbox covered with green cloths supported the dim little photographs and crumbling frames she liked to have near her couch. She did not really need them, for nothing had been lost, as a company of traveling players carry with them everywhere, while they still remember their lines. A windy heath, a misty castle, an enchanted island, so she had with her all that her soul had stored. With great clarity I can see her sitting at a table and serenely considering the laid-out cards of a game in solitaire. She leans on her left elbow and presses to her cheek the free thumb of her left hand, in which, close to her mouth, she holds a cigarette, while her right hand stretches forward to the next card. The double gleam on her 4th finger is to marriage rings, her own and my father's, which, being too large for her, is fastened to hers by a bit of black thread. Whenever in my dreams I see the dead, they always appear silent, bothered, strangely depressed, quite unlike their dear bright selves. I am aware of them without any astonishment, in surroundings they never visited during their earthly existence, in the house of some friend of mine they never knew. They sit apart, frowning at the floor, as if death were a dark taint, a shameful family secret. It is certainly not then, not in dreams, but when one is wide awake, at moments of robust joy and achievement, on the highest terrace of consciousness, that mortality has a chance to peer beyond its own limits, from the past, and its castle tower. And although nothing much can be seen through the mist, there is somehow the blissful feeling that one is looking in the right direction.